Hello everyone, DarkOfAllTrades here. Now for some reason, many atheists love to hate on presuppositionalist arguments. Even I think they're intellectually lazy at best and intentionally philosophically confusing at worst. I've done a few videos where I had to address presuppositionalism, but I haven't gone in depth into the approach for a number of reasons. Well, today I am going to go in depth and see what all the fuss is about with this whole type of argument. If you were to ask presuppositional apologists about the foundation of knowledge, their differing responses would eventually point back to the requirement for the existence of God. Presuppositionalism is an argument by Christian apologists that, in a nutshell, claims all rational thought depends upon God. By essentially trying to expose non-believers' worldviews as logically borrowing from a theistic worldview, they aim to leave Christianity as the last worldview standing. Though this approach to defending Christianity may appear philosophically complex, a thorough investigation exposes flaws in the reasoning involved. For this, I intend to steelman the presuppositionalists' argument, articulating it in its strongest form in order to integrate both charitable and critical analysis. Upon closer inspection, we will see that presuppositional apologetics employs some thought-provoking rhetoric on the surface, but ultimately rests more on unproven assumptions than cogent reasoning. By understanding the crux of this argument from its foundation, we can better evaluate theological assumptions, follow the evidence wherever it leads, and gain insight into building true knowledge. Presuppositionalists argue that the existence of the God of the Bible is the necessary precondition for rational thought, logic, knowledge, morality, and other foundations that people depend upon to make sense of the world and acquire knowledge. Their reasoning goes as follows. Humans take the ability to think logically and rationally for granted. However, presuppositionalists argue that rational, coherent thought would be impossible without the rational God to account for this capacity. Positing God as the genesis of rational personhood supposedly solves this philosophical dilemma. Similarly, the universal laws of logic we depend on would be impossible in a random, chaotic universe. The order and stability inherent in concepts like the law of non-contradiction suggest a divine orderer who constructed and upheld these logical principles. Presuppositionalists claim God provides the transcendental justification for using logic, preventing it from being an arbitrary human convention. People depend on their senses, memory, and reasoning to acquire knowledge, but without God as the standard of knowledge and truth, knowledge could not be justified. Presuppositionalists present God as the universal, absolute authority who designed humans as thinking beings. Removing God from the picture supposedly results in devastating skepticism about knowing anything definitively. Presuppositional apologists attempt to establish that the existence of the Christian God must be taken for granted in order for rationality, logic, knowledge, and moral judgment to even get off the ground. God is positioned as the necessary, transcendental requirement for all human thought and meaningful experience. Let's take a look at the argument. 1. Knowledge, rational thought, logic, moral judgments, and other foundations of human cognition require an adequate justification to be meaningful. 2. Without an absolute universal God as the source of justification of these foundations, they become arbitrary human conventions without an objective basis. 3. Only the God of the Bible has the necessary attributes, omniscience, immutability, faithfulness, etc., to serve as the absolute justification for these foundations. 4. Therefore, the existence of the Christian God must be presupposed in order for knowledge, rational thought, logic, moral truths, and other cognitive foundations to be possible. 5. People depend on knowledge, rational thought, logic, and moral truths. 6. Therefore, the existence of the Christian God must be presupposed for any functioning worldview or basis for knowledge. This boils down the structure to Premise 1. Cognitive foundations require universal justification. Premise 2. Only the Christian God can provide this justification. Premise 3. Humans depend on these cognitive foundations. Conclusion. Therefore, the existence of the Christian God must be presupposed for knowledge. While on the surface, presuppositional apologetics presents some intriguing ideas, further analysis exposes several flaws. Presupposing God as the justification for logic and rational thought simply begs the question. This is circular logic. They presuppose what the argument seeks to demonstrate at its conclusion. Arbitrarily exempting one's assumed axiom, God, from the requirement of the proof commits the special pleading fallacy. Many worldviews could hypothetically serve as the necessary precondition for rational thought. Presuppositionalists privilege the Bible, but other scriptures could justify reasoning using similar arguments. Achieving internal consistency within one worldview does not make it true. Even if we grant that logic, reason, and knowledge require some absolute basis, this does not mean that basis must be the God of the Bible. There could be many other possible explanations, or even unknown explanations. Presuppositionalists prematurely leap to the Christian God explanation without justification. Presuppositionalists often present a trilemma where they claim the options for worldviews are either circular reasoning, infinite regression, or accepting the presupposition of God. But this is a false and limited set of options. Worldviews can be grounded in evidence, empirical verification, pragmatism, etc., without needing an arbitrary presupposition. Presuppositionalists often use the term logic in an equivocal way. The abstract logic that describes reasoning patterns is not necessarily connected to the universal logical absolutes they argue for. Conflating the two uses of logic is misleading. Let me break this one down a bit more. The presuppositional argument relies on playing fast and loose with two distinct definitions of the term logic. One is the formal principles of valid reasoning, modus ponens, law of non-contradiction, etc. The second is the assumed capital L laws of logic TM that govern the universe, which must be accounted for. Presuppositional apologists argue that without God grounding these universal logical absolutes, we couldn't rely on logic, definition 1, to reason or acquire knowledge. But there's no reason to think that the reliable descriptive principles of logical reasoning, which are conceptual tools developed by humans, are connected to or dependent on divine universal logical entities that govern the structure of reality. Conflating these two senses of logic make it seem like undermining the existence of the second would undermine the first. But even if logical absolutes were shown not to exist, we could still rely on logic, definition 1, to reason. By failing to distinguish these two meanings, the argument again relies more on rhetoric and assumption than actual logical connection. The presuppositional argument aims to critique all other worldviews as lacking ultimate justification, but it fails by its own criteria, as Christianity lacks justification without assuming the truth of the Bible, which is the very point in question. This inconsistency further highlights the argument's flaws. Simply because humans lack an explanation for some phenomena like logic, consciousness, etc., it does not mean the Christian God explanation wins by default. Our lack of omniscience at this point does not make their theological assumptions true. While the flaws already mentioned are fatal to the argument as a whole, presuppositionalists present some of their more, we'll say, intriguing ideas when claiming God is necessary for knowledge, logic, and rational thought specifically. So let's look at each of these more directly. Presuppositionalists argue that knowledge depends on God as the foundation of truth and the universal standard of knowledge, without which knowledge assertions become relative or lack justification. They claim finite, contingent beings could not access knowledge without divine revelation. However, this essentially sets the bar for justification at a level equivalent to omniscience. Our actual human knowledge has shown itself to be quite robust and reliable for meaningful existence, even if the mechanisms behind that reliability await further explanation. We all rely on bits of finite, contingent knowledge constantly to successfully navigate reality, e.g. the moisture of the clouds likely indicates rain soon. Our aggregate knowledge lacks explanatory completion about the total nature of absolute reality, but to wield that limitation in claiming inability to know anything cogently resembles the unreasonable requirement for a surveyor to have completely and perfectly mapped all of England before measuring any single field. That experts in a field can justifiably measure and verify claims using finite reasoning contradicts the radically skeptical implications of rejecting knowledge absent an omniscient justification. Here, presuppositionalists style logical absolutes as mysterious, immaterial laws that science cannot account for but seem to extend universally as almost Platonic entities underlying existence and thought. However, the principles of logic likely originate directly from comprehensible patterns inherent in existence itself rather than requiring injection from outside reality. For example, the law of identity, something is what it is, derives directly from observing persisting characteristics of real-world entities over time. Even more so, hypothetical transcendent logical entities are explanatorily superfluous. We can actively build up coherent logical systems using just the basic relations between real things. Empirically verifying that physical things possess identity independent of human thought accounts for classical logic without further metaphysical assumptions. Science has made great progress revealing the rationality inherent in reality. Presuppositionalists argue that the very existence of rational thought amongst humans requires accounting for, and that only being fashioned rationally by a divine creator could explain the source of reason itself. They claim trusting our reasoning depends on the assumption that it was installed properly to function rationally, much like trusting a calculator depends on it being well designed. However, this analogy only superficially appeals to intuition. Our modern understandings of neuroscience and biology provides bona fide explanations of brain and complexity emerging through evolution, absent divine intervention. The physical architecture of the brain's neural networks yields sophisticated information processing, and we have AI systems like chess computers demonstrating high levels of reasoning solely from material complexity and programming. Furthermore, even our faulty intuitions often land on pragmatically workable solutions, not due to perfect internal coherence, but because they have evolved good enough rationality to aid survival. Rather than ransack our origins before we use reason, we can justify trust in reason by evaluating the results it produces, improving theories, better technology, accurate predictions, etc. What credibly accounts for rational thought comes back to physical explanations rather than naked assumptions about dubious divine origins. To wrap all this part up, while the presuppositional argument for God's existence raises intriguing ideas about knowledge, rationality, and logic needing external grounding, further analysis uncovers several fatal flaws. The reasoning involved essentially boils down to an elaborate begging the question fallacy and special pleading, as it arbitrarily exempts one assumed axiom from the very burden of proof it demands from all other worldviews. Additionally, for the argument's strongest points about the justification of knowledge, logic, and reason, we find that current scientific understanding provides simpler explanations without needing to invoke divine origins. Presuppositionalists too hastily construe the limitations of human knowledge as inability to know anything absent a divine revealer. But our contingent pragmatic knowledge remains remarkably reliable and testable, and abstract principles of logic find parsimonious origins in the basic structures of reality rather than requiring metaphysical grounding by a creator. While superficially wielding an aura of profundity in its attempt to undermine all opposition, upon applying proper scrutiny, we uncover the leaps in logic and the avoidance of evidence underlying presuppositionalism. Its rhetorical flair outpaces its reason, hoping to bedazzle rather than convince. An impartial evaluation finds it guilty of the very circularity and groundless assumptions it accuses all other worldviews of committing. Therefore, while an intriguing effort, the presuppositional approach fails as a cogent argument due to its logical shortcomings and lack of justification for its own lofty assumptions. A more reasonable quest for knowledge requires building sound arguments from the ground up, solidly anchored to reality, rather than attempting to float the entire worldview on ephemeral clouds of our imagination. There are few likely reasons presuppositional arguments persist in religious reasoning despite their flaws. Though logically unsustained, presuppositionalism sounds profound and uses heavy philosophical terminology. This makes it rhetorically impressive in a debate context when not rigorously analyzed. It puts opponents on their heels and can flummox those unfamiliar with the approach. Building one's worldview entirely around a god and scripture can resonate profoundly on an emotional level for believers. Regardless of outside critiques, it just makes sense and feels right from an internal perspective. This creates a seductive subjective appeal. Some religious thinkers may depend heavily on presuppositionalism because they perceive a dearth of other compelling apologetic arguments. It provides what sounds like a complex intellectual defense when simpler evidential arguments struggle. For those already committed to Christianity, presupposing religious assumptions creates the illusion of certainty and guard against cognitive dissonance. Any contrary evidence gets pre-rejected since non-believers borrow rationality from believers. This effectively locks in dogmatic mindsets. Overall, the stubborn persistence likely stems from a combination of exploiting logical loopholes, leaning into subjective appeal, lacking stronger alternatives, and providing a shield to preserve assumptions against criticism. The appearance still overrides the substance. Since many believers already accept its scriptural assumptions, internal critiques seem less compelling or important. Before I end, I'd like to leave you all with this. The transcendental argument for the non-existence of God, also called Tang, was put forth by Michael Martin in a 1996 article in New Zealand Rationalist and Humanist. The basic structure is: Premise 1. Knowledge, logic, rational thought, and morality require that God does not exist. Premise 2. People do have knowledge, employ logic and rationality, and make moral judgments. Conclusion: therefore, arguments for God's existence fail. The argument contends that the existence of God is actually incompatible with the necessary preconditions for knowledge and rationality that we clearly possess as humans. Regarding logic, the existence of an omnipotent God would undermine the necessity of logical absolutes. For example, if God can do anything, then he could conceivably make a merry bachelor or a squared circle logically coherent. but that contradicts the law of non-contradiction. Modern apologists have redefined the omnis to allow God to not fall victim to the omni paradox. Instead, they assert that a God can do anything that is logically possible. However, when pressed, these same apologists will say that God could make things differently. This suggests logical absolutes cannot be guaranteed on theism, as they are subject to God's unlimited power to reorder reality. However, we very clearly rely on invariant logical laws, so theological assumptions about God's nature fail as prerequisites for intelligibility here. Regarding morality, for objective morality to exist, moral truths must be necessary rather than merely dependent on the arbitrary commands of a powerful being. Additionally, meaningful moral judgments require free will and rational reflection to assess actions. But the existence of an omniscient creator and divine commander precludes genuine free will, moral autonomy, and the reasoning in lieu of obedience. Hence, God's existence undercuts the necessary conditions for objective moral truths and judgments. Regarding knowledge, science depends on methodological naturalism, focusing on testable, intersubjective phenomena rather than alleged supernatural forces. But a transcendent God not bounded by the natural laws and available for objective investigation violates the very prerequisites for scientific knowledge. So belief in this theological conception of God must be rejected for science's demonstrable success. In essence, the Tang contends that belief in God fundamentally clashes with, rather than supports, our actual grounds for knowledge, logic, and morality that are undeniably operative. Thus, it employs an internal critique to demonstrate the incoherence of arguments asserting God's existence as necessary for such foundations. So this counter-argument essentially takes the presuppositional tactic and uses it against theological assumptions. It argues that it is the non-existence of God that must be a transcendental prerequisite for much of human knowledge and rational thought we clearly rely upon. The Tang functions as a clever philosophical rebuttal by attempting to demonstrate the incompatibility of a sovereign God with the necessary grounds for intelligibility. While not a positive argument for atheism itself, it aims to logically undermine theism as untenable. Ultimately, the greatest strength or the strongest foundation of the presuppositional approach is also its Achilles heel. Granting any assumed axiom allows one to logically demonstrate anything dependent upon that presupposition. By requiring the initial acceptance of God's existence in order to make sense of any other knowledge, the argument could just as easily posit the existence of unicorns or fairies or my magical primordial space crystal as necessary presuppositions by its own reasoning. This flexibility to accommodate any arbitrary presupposition reveals the failure of presuppositionalism. It can be used to prove anything and therefore proves nothing at all on its own merits without begging the question. That's it for this one, so what did you think? Do you think I nailed presuppositionalist arguments to the point where they can't recover? Or do you think I missed something important here? Let me know in the comments. A lot of people have been asking me for this, and some have been taunting me saying I don't understand presuppositionalism. Well, here is your evidence that I have some kind of understanding of the arguments and effortlessly dismantled them in a way that anyone can understand. Though if something wasn't quite clear to you, please ask in the comments or email me the question if you don't want to ask publicly. My email is in the description. Also, if you like this style of video, let me know. I'm open to do more straight educational dives on certain topics. And if you have any other ideas you want me to discuss, again, let me know in the comments or by my email. I would tell you, but I presuppose that you have already hit the like button and have subscribed, so I don't need to go over that. Though I do need to give a thanks to my patrons: Calamitous Anima, Long-Haired Lefty, Musical Ocelot, Ooga Booga Luga, Tarek Alkasab, Jamminbomb, Kai Henningsen, Triple Towel, and now welcome to Sora. Because you all exist, my channel must exist. I may not have come this far without you. If you'd like to be the Tang response, you can join them for as low as $1 a month at patreon.com/DarkOfAllTrades. I have some exciting plans for the channel in the works now. I'm not gonna go into details just yet, but when I can, patrons will be the first to know. Let's just say many of you have been pushing for me to do something, and something may just happen. I promise to keep you all posted though. Until then, as always, keep learning.